Hello, everyone. I'm Linda Hogan, Chief Operating Officer at Beta Rudder, Tempo Board Member and Vice Chair of the Tempo Communications Committee. And on behalf of everyone at Tempo, I'd like to welcome you to today's Tempo Real Talks. The focus of today's Real Talk session is meaningful D&I conversations in the workplace and how we can foster and encourage these important opportunities for learning and sharing. Direct Positive, a documentary film born of a partnership between Tempo and Beta Rudder, my company, serves as a catalyst for such a conversation. And through our moderator and panel today, we hope it'll spark you to think about how you can encourage conversations in your organization about the importance of women rising in leadership roles, how far we've come, and how far we still need to go. First, a little bit about our Tempo Real Talks. This is the first session of the year. We do this quarterly, first Thursdays from 4 until 5:30. These are planned and sponsored by Tempo's DEI Education and Training Subcommittee. So thank you to all members of that committee for the work they've been doing to put these very important talks on. And really what these are designed to do is to meet members where they are on their D&I journeys through experiential learning opportunities. So we hope that you enjoy listening, learning, and contributing to real conversations on impactful topics that are important to all of us. A few housekeeping items before we dive in. These sessions are held as webinars, so all attendees have their cameras disabled. However, we still encourage you to interact with our speakers. The chat box and the Q&A function are enabled for you to speak with them and other attendees, share your thoughts and ideas. We'll leave some time at the end for Q&A, so submit your questions at any point during the session. Regarding today's documentary, Direct Positive came to life as part of Tempo's Share Your Story campaign last summer. The experiences, wisdom, and learning gleaned from the women of Tempo really demanded to be shared with a larger audience in a unique and meaningful way. You received a link to the film today, so I hope you were able to view it. If not, I hope you'll make time to watch it soon. Guiding our journey is today's Real Talk moderator and DEI expert, Alia Berman. Chair of the Tempo D&I Committee, Alia is the Chief Diversity Officer for TBWA North America and GMR Marketing. She is responsible for leading the vision, strategy, and execution of TBWA's diversity, equity, and inclusion efforts across the collective. Alia is a Tempo board member and also serves on the board for the Institute for Women's Leadership. Our panel is comprised of women who have risen, overcome challenges, and inspired others with their courage, vulnerability, and honesty. Two of them are featured in the film. Margaret Henningsen was a founder of Legacy Bank, a state-chartered commercial bank that was the heart of the city of Milwaukee. At the age of 50, she followed her dream of addressing the lack of comprehensive banking services for women and minorities in her community. An advocate for empowering them, she recognized that the ability to create wealth was necessary to transform lives. She later served as the executive director of the Women's Fund of Greater Milwaukee, funding women and girls-led social change initiatives. Semi-retired, she is currently the community advisor for Forward Community Investments. Margaret is also founder of the Milwaukee Juneteenth celebration. Maggie Dawn is a Milwaukee County Chief Legal Officer, where she is responsible for the provision of civil legal services to all departments and elected officials in Milwaukee County, as well as various community-facing legal services, including guardianship and psychological commitment proceedings. Prior to joining the city, Maggie worked for two global law firms. At these firms, she specialized in security fraud claims and other complex class action and commercial litigation matters. Additionally, Maggie is an award-winning radio broadcaster, having achieved the Wisconsin Broadcasters Association 2019 Top Award for Large Market Interview for her weekly radio show, Dawn of the Resistance, on WRRD Madison and 101.7 FM Milwaukee. The last member of our panel is the visionary behind the film, who led an all-female creative team to bring it to life. Sarah Comet Hunt is an executive creative director at Beta Rudder who brings 20 years of experience as an art director and creative director for both consumer and business-to-business marketing. Since joining Beta Rudder, she has led award-winning work for such brands as GE Healthcare, Office Max, Eastman, Johnson Controls, and Northwestern Mutual. Her philosophy is that the best brands, whether they are business to business or business to consumer, create human connections with every interaction centered around that idea. And now to start our conversation, here's Alia Berman.
Hi, thanks so much, Linda. Hi, everyone. I'm so excited to be here with you and to have this discussion with Sarah, Maggie, and Margaret. There was so much of their experiences that they discussed in the film that really resonated with me and that I wanted to hear so much more about. So I am going to dive right in because they have a lot of questions for them, and I'm sure you all do as well. As Linda stated, I'll leave about 15 minutes or so at the end of the discussion for your questions, but feel free to put them in the chat box throughout our discussion. So I'm going to start with you, Sarah, the visionary behind Direct Positive, and want to start with talking about why you chose the artist Margaret Musa and her photography style to help share the Tempo women's stories.
Yeah, so the idea for the film, it initially came out of wanting to use art to kind of start conversations. And when we thought about the perfect artist to do this, we landed on Margaret Musa because she explores applying tintype photography to modern portraits of people, all sorts of people. But we loved the idea of taking that tintype technique and applying it to modern portraits of strong women, because there was a lot of tension there that we thought could be a really interesting way to kind of shape our story and capture all of the stories of the women. So, there's the tension and the contrast between the antique style and kind of the modern cues of wardrobe and pose from a visual standpoint, but also just that idea of the tension of how far we've come since that process was invented as women, and also, how far we still have to go. And the idea of the images being unfiltered and unretouched, kind of these raw, honest images, when right now we're kind of used to living in a world where social media filters and Photoshop edits kind of rule the day, and we're so used to seeing these filtered images that maybe create these kind of unrealistic ideals. So that's kind of where the whole idea started, and then it just kept growing from there when we realized how powerful all of the women's stories were, and wanting to be able to bring that to a larger audience.
Yeah, I love that, the idea of authenticity, and your photographs, and being able to show things, in your words, without filters, and showing people for who they really are. So as Linda mentioned at the beginning, the film was produced by an all-female cast. Why was that important, and how did it impact the overall experience in making the film?
Yeah, I think it was really important because the ideas on gathering the stories could really come from a place of shared experience and empathy. And I think, because of that, it's kind of funny that this became a real passion project for all of us. And hopefully it led to deeper work and an honesty in the work, because it felt like we could really trust each other. We were all kind of coming from the same place versus, sometimes when you're a creative, you end up being handed a brief, and, maybe it's an experience that you don't relate to. You can only bring, your own level of experience to it. But because we were all kind of coming from this shared understanding, we could kind of trust each other to let the stories lead us where we needed to go while staying true to that core vision, because we had that trust and that kind of deep understanding. So that's where I think it was so important to, you know, have people working on this who were all kind of coming from maybe some really shared experience.
Yeah. So, Margaret and Maggie, I just want to ask you a question about that. I mean, hearing Sarah talk about how like trust and, you know, sort of shared experience and understanding is kind of, you know, at the sort of overlay across the film. Margaret, I'll start with you. What was your experience just being a part of the film, and what was it like reflecting on your professional journey?
I'm going to start with reflecting on my journey. Whenever I have to do that, I'm surprised, number one, that I'm still around, and number two, that I'm still smiling. That's the first thing. But when I was initially approached about participating in the film, I didn't have all the background information about why it was being done. But once I arrived at Beta Rudder and started talking to the staff and to the photographer, I thought to myself, wow, this is really fantastic. It's all women, which I didn't get to see much over the course of my career. Even if I asked, well, do you have a woman photographer or filmmaker, or do you have a Black photographer? You know, I would be met by silence. So this to me was an excellent opportunity for women to showcase their skills, you know, so that we don't have to keep asking, do you have anybody? But people would know right away, this is what they should be doing. It's the right thing. And I loved being in what I would describe as a safe space, where during the interview, I felt like I could say anything I wanted. And if you've seen this film, you know, we said anything we wanted. And that was empowering, to know that women, I could see the crew nodding their heads as all of us were talking about the different scenarios that we had participated in.
Yeah, wonderful. Absolutely. Maggie, how would you respond to that question? So what was your experience being part of the film, and what was it like for you to reflect on your professional journey?
Emotional, right? I think anytime we're asked to reflect and try to engage in what I call like radical honesty, that is by definition a really emotional experience if you're engaging it in an open way with your defenses down. As a leader, I've tried to engage with my own vulnerability a lot, both about my own weaknesses and areas for improvement, and how I can share those and be open in sharing what's been challenging for me, in the hopes that in being vulnerable and emotional about things, that those are seen not as detracting from my skill set, but really multiplying and exponentially improving my skill set and sharing with others, and constantly creating, as Margaret was saying, safe places for women and everyone to be vulnerable, to honestly and really humbly engage with what our experiences are, so that we all feel that increasing number of spaces and places are safe for us to share our lived experiences and to hear from others what theirs have been. I think that's really the only way to really grow and be present in these moments. So it was really emotional for me. I was surprised. I was surprised that I actually got choked up when I was speaking about it, because I've talked about it so many times. It's a long time ago. Mm-hmm. Yet I think all of us can think of experiences that, no matter how far in the rear view they may be, they still catch us. So it was really emotional for me in a good and affirming way.
Yeah, I mean, so you both talk about safety. And, you know, Margaret, you mentioned how important it is to feel that sense of safety, you know, as you were talking about your experience. And Maggie, you know, you talked about your experience being emotional and vulnerable. And so, you know, again, safety is so critical. Sarah, how does having an all-female cast specifically play into creating safety for those involved in the film?
Yeah, I think that you know, we were hoping to create a space where, you know, it would feel like there wasn't any judgment. You know, and I think because we could all, you know, even though we might not be coming from exactly the same place, we could all kind of relate to the experiences of each other. And you know, one interesting note is, you know, all of these women that we had interviewed are such fantastic mentors, and we actually had a very young woman, a first time director, leading the interviews. And it created this really interesting dynamic where it was almost like, you know, everyone forgot that the cameras were rolling, and it didn't feel like an interview, you know, which can feel very, it can feel very kind of daunting when you feel like, okay, I'm being interviewed, there's someone sitting there asking me questions. And Jess, our director, you know, I think having her lead the interviews, it just created this sense almost of these little mini mentoring sessions, or that was kind of the vibe that I got. So it really kind of blew me away just how much all of you were willing to share, and just the vulnerability that people were willing to let us see. So that was, you know, really wonderful in thinking about, you know, okay, it felt like we managed to create that space, and even down to thinking about the space that we were in too. We didn't want it to feel like a cold studio. So that's why we chose the location that we did, with, you know, kind of vintage elements and, you know, velvet sofas where people could feel kind of almost nurtured and relaxed, and know that they're kind of surrounded by friends too.
Yeah, it's really interesting because, you know, one of the things I really wanted to hear from you is how the experience, you know, was different than, you know, what it might have been if you had men on set. And one of the things I, you know, heard you say was there was like mini mentoring, and that it creates a dynamic of like women offering up other like advice and insights, you know, based on their past experience. But what other things would you say, you know, differed with having an all-female production team, than what it would have been like if there were men involved?
Yeah, that's a great question. So, I mean, it also felt like the team worked in a very fluid way together. So, you know, it was kind of like we all understood a common goal and could center around it and work together, and that made us more open to maybe shifting and changing as the project needed, versus, you know, I think of like, you know, maybe a traditional male model of leadership being a little bit more command and control, and then maybe creating tension when things don't go exactly according to plan. You know, and this way we were all kind of, you know, centering around a common goal, and we were able to shift and change and maybe be a little bit more collaborative with each other too, because there was that trust that, you know, we kind of, now we got it, even if it feels a little bit chaotic at moments, you know, we're going to work through it in the end. And it was really kind of interesting that we had a male producer who jumped in to help us out. And he really became kind of an advocate and almost like a cheerleader for this way of working. You know, after we were done, I've heard him really advocate for, like, wow, you know, this was great. It felt like we were more creative because we could be led where the stories needed to take us, versus having that kind of command and control and that kind of rigidity that kind of creates a lot of tension. So I know he's become, you know, kind of an advocate for, like, hey, this is a way that we should be working more often. So it's true to that kind of direct positive model that, you know, once we get these different ways of thinking out there, it can benefit everybody, not just women. So, you know, it's kind of, there are no winners or losers. Like, getting this shift in perspective can be really rich for a lot of people.
Yeah, I think that is so cool that, the, you know, a more collaborative model allows for the story to go where it wants naturally, versus being, you know, very directive and saying that this is where the story needs to, like, you know, start or stop. So I think that is a really key piece in talking about how women help shape the dynamics of, you know, teams. um Margaret, I want to move to you and to your story. And I thought your story was so compelling. And one of the most compelling pieces of your story, besides the fact that you are the first woman to ever charter a commercial bank in the history of Wisconsin, is that you did it at 50 years old. And that's an age when society tells us as women that we're no longer creative, innovative, or valuable. So my question for you is two-part. How was your age at 50 an asset when you embarked on that entrepreneurial journey? And then what do you have to say about your creativity, resourcefulness, and value as a woman at 50 when you opened Legacy Bank and even now?
Well, first of all, at the day after my 50th birthday, I had a moment of temporary insanity. I have a lot of those, and decided I was going to start my own bank. But that decision arose out of so many times having conversations with people, especially women, and especially women of color, who were denied a loan to buy a house or start a business. And even though there was a lot of activity going on in Milwaukee where people were saying they were going to try to do the right thing and make sure that everybody had a shot at creating wealth, behind the scenes, that was not happening. So that's how I got there at the age of 50. And to me, age is just a number. And I actually never really thought about the fact that I was 50 when I decided to do this, but other people kept saying over and over again, and she's 50 years old and she's starting this, this bank and this new career. Because to me, age is just a number. And I've said this to women so many times, I always talk about my age. Number one, I'm astounded and happy that I'm still around. And I'm 75 now for people who in the audience who don't know me, but I think it's really important for us to acknowledge our age because experience comes with age. Men use their experience that comes with age all the time, which is why you find men in their 70s, 80s, 90s still running the show because they don't see anything wrong with being that. But many people, this is what got my attention, is many people were astounded that I would make a decision like that, as they put it, at the age of 50. So to me, it was just something else I, wanted to do, and I knew that I was going to do it. And the day after my birthday, I thought, oh, this is crazy. I can't take this anymore. And just the whole concept of age. But the good side of it is I have way more experience because of my age, dealing with certain situations, understanding what needed to be done. I had the ability to know where to get information to convince people this could actually happen because of my age. So that's something that I don't think women think about because we get so hung up in, oh my goodness, I'm 45, I'm 50, I'm this or that, and I'm too old to do that. You're never too old to do anything that you want to do as long as you're doing it in the right way. So I would also say lessons learned,
Mm-hmm.
I haven't learned all the lessons I should have learned about why I should be doing something. But I think that as you age, there are certain pitfalls you can avoid. There are certain people you can avoid. You have had an opportunity to have more conversations. I tell people all the time, I have 1 million pieces of data in my head, just because of my age and all the experiences I've had. But it was a challenge. However, it was a challenge because people kept focusing on my age and the age of my two partners who worked on this with me, all three of us, 3 Black women in their 50s. Who would have thunk it?
Yeah. I mean, it is really angering to me, to hear that it was a big deal that, at 50 years old, you were taking on, one of the biggest ventures in your life. I mean,
yes,
I would venture to say that was probably one of your greatest strengths at that time, because you had the benefit, like you said, of past lived experiences and maybe not reacting to things in the same way that you would have if you were, you know, a newer or younger professional.
Yeah.
But even to hear you talk about the pitfalls that you can avoid based on experience, I mean, there's some, you know, clear advantages, I think, with age.
And I think the other advantage of age is you can out-talk most of the people that you're trying to convince, because you have so many life experiences and things that you've been through. You've had more time to think about things and how you're going to make them happen. The other thing is you can turn to people who are in your same age group who want to see you be successful. That happened to me a lot. A lot of women said to me, wow, I wish I would have just gone ahead and done what I wanted to do at your age, older women. But that is another sort of piece of the puzzle that falls into place for us if we look at aging as a plus instead of a minus.
Yes, exactly. It's all about our mindset and how we view it. I like how you said that you always acknowledge your age, you know, that's really important to you, and it's
Yep.
something to be proud of versus something, you know, to hide.
I do. Well, for one thing, I think I look pretty good for my age, but
You look
especially
great,
now.
You look
But
great.
at the time I was thinking about starting a bank, I would be laying in the bed sometimes at night looking at the ceiling going, what was I thinking of? It wasn't because of my age, though. It was because of the amount of work that I had taken on. Even though I had thought about it, when I actually made the decision, it was more of a snap decision driven by a conversation I'd had with somebody that day, a professional Black woman, about how she'd been treated by another bank. And I was working at a bank at the time, so I also was able to see what was happening on the inside. And because I'd been in the industry, real estate, banking, all of that for so long, I think I had a different perspective that I could throw in people's face and say, well, I wouldn't have to do this if you would take care of it.
Yeah. I want to move to Maggie, because Maggie, one of the things I you know, found myself just sitting and reflecting on quite a bit in your story is you talked about how you were let go from a prestigious law firm and was told that you weren't going to cut it. And I got hung up on wondering like what the characteristics or behaviors that they saw in you that made them think that you wouldn't cut it. And you know, so I'm curious if you know what those were, and if you consider those weaknesses of yours, or if you actually look at them as strengths.
Thanks, Alia. Really complex question, right? I want to start by saying this. When you are in the midst of a traumatic work environment or a trauma, your ability to sort of rationally assess your performance, the performance of others in the situation will be compromised because your brain is in the midst of a trauma response. And I think as a culture and as a world, we've come through a pandemic and we're still challenged by that. But one of the positive outcomes of that is that I think people are engaging in understanding workplace trauma in a very different way, as well as workplace stress. So what I want to begin with is this observation. I was unable at that point in time to have any objective, reliable assessment of my own performance or how it was being perceived, because my brain was flooded with all sorts of stress hormones. I was not sleeping well at all. I was maybe getting 3 hours of sleep a night. My situation was probably in one of the most extreme sets of circumstances. Read here, like working 80 hours a week, maybe getting 3 to 4 hours of sleep, and constantly being berated, verbally abused, unrealistic timelines, insufficient amount of resources to complete deadlines, and then absolute perfection being demanded of me in my work product. Those things cannot be achieved when you are sleep deprived and your brain is flooded with stress hormones. So I want to begin there and say that I had been a compulsive perfectionist and overachiever in every aspect of my life for as long as I had memory. I'm talking about hospital corners on my bed as a child. I think my greatest failure was not being able to understand what really necessitated perfection and not being able to ask that of the people that were managing me. And as a result, because of the way I was oriented, that my expectation of myself was perfection and perfection in everything, I was not able to exercise judgment in a productive way to prioritize the seemingly endless set of tasks with seemingly impossible deadlines. I also didn't simply say when I thought I couldn't get it done. I blamed myself for not being able to work 24 hours a day, and I internalized that failure, which further compromised my own mental health. So I think as the further I've gotten away from that period of time in my career, the less, I'll be candid, the environment was toxic, the expectations were unreasonable, but the further away from it I've gotten, while I still hold that entity accountable and the people that treated me poorly, badly, and abusively accountable for their decisions, what I bring myself back to is what could I have done to better establish boundaries that were reasonable professional boundaries so that I could achieve and perform the best that I could under extraordinary circumstances. We all are going to face that moment in our careers where poo is hitting fan and things are crazy and out of control and the stress levels are enormous. When you're in those moments, the questions are, what are the top priorities? Where are the resources? And if we can't do everything perfectly, again, what are the most important things to get as right as we possibly can? And I didn't have those boundaries and I was unable to ask those questions. As I've moved forward, I never, ever, ever want to repeat that again in my career. And so I have tried to constantly remind myself of what may be appropriate boundaries. How do I renegotiate those on an ongoing basis? Boundaries aren't, set and done and never revisited. I think that's part of the evolution that we all go through as professionals. It's a negotiation with your boss, with the people whom you manage, and trying to figure out what works. And so being reflective and aware of my own mental health needs, as well as boundaries, again, resources, priorities, and accepting that perfection is not possible, nor is that a reasonable expectation. So again, those cultures, those individuals are accountable for abuse and mistreatment, but I can't force them to be better. I can only look inward and say, I didn't set the boundaries that I needed to. And if the end result would have still been that I was let go, I would have been in a better place when they let me go.
Yeah.
The last thing I just want to say is this. My entire identity at that point in time in my life was completely and utterly bound up and indistinguishable from Margaret Dawn, lawyer at this very prestigious law firm. That was how I saw myself. And so one of the other things was that my identity isn't my job title. It's an important part of who I am. I want professional success. I want to be acknowledged for that, but it is not who I am. How I do my work is a much clearer reflection of my character and who I am. It is not in my title. So it's somewhat of an answer, maybe a lawyerly answer, Alia, but thank you for a really tough question that caused me to revisit again something that I continue to try to learn from.
Yeah, I mean, you said so much there, so many incredible, things that I think many of us have struggled with or currently struggle with, but don't know even how to articulate those things because you're not even sure what the actual issue is. So, I mean, first, thanks for, acknowledging that there is legitimate trauma, and, in workplace trauma and stress that happens as a result of behaviors within the workplace. I think we could have an hour and a half long discussion on that alone. But a couple of things you said were also really interesting to me. So I was curious from your perspective, what you think some of the patterns are that you've noticed over the years about women at work, and that don't help in terms of like their advancement or mental health and wellness within the workplace. And a couple of things you mentioned, I know are specific to you, but I also wonder if women tend to struggle with these things as well, is perfectionism. And then also sometimes a difficulty or inability to set boundaries. So if you could just talk to that a bit, what are some of the patterns that you notice about women at work and things that they could be doing better, to help with their mental and, emotional, physical well-being, and also advancement at work.
It really powerful question, right? That I think so many people who are experts in human resources and psychologists and psychiatrists could probably answer with a whole lot more specificity than I can. Humbly trying to learn from my own experience. What I will say is that I think I wanted people to believe and respect me as a professional, and that any weakness, vulnerability, need, or inability to handle it all without seemingly break a sweat was how I understood men and my profession to view women and me, that was the standard, and anything short of that was sort of a very personal failing. And so I think separating what is really about you and what you can do better, or the boundaries that we can set, from what might be system or culture, is oftentimes something that I find myself doing. I'm making it about me, whether that's a critique, sometimes the things that go well, when really successes and failures are oftentimes rarely about an individual, and they are reflective of a whole series of decisions, a whole series of prioritizations that we as individuals are just a small part of. So I guess if I could be so bold as to say, here are some things I hope all of us as women and underrepresented people in new and different spaces can say, is absolutely understand that it may not be about you, and how to understand what is your responsibility and what is not, what you cannot control and what you can control is a really important distinction. And again, I think the idea of boundaries and never dismissing what are real and genuinely challenging mental and physical health issues. These things, I believe, can be uniquely acute for women and people of color. And there is a very real, concrete reason for this. And that is, in many spaces, women and people of color are some of the last people in those spaces. In other words, we are non-traditional in those spaces. This means that in periods of economic contraction, as a general rule, it's last in, first out, which means organizations are more often than not pushing out people of color and women when they must lay off or contract workforce. And workplaces are not the best at acknowledging their own biases and discrimination, which may be implicit. And so there's a lot of blame and failures that are assigned to women and people of color when these things are happening. Again, this gets back to, is this really about me, or is this about an economic contraction, people that don't understand their own blind spots and implicit biases, and knowing how to protect and preserve your mental health and physical health through those periods of time, I think is really important. Oftentimes these factors, these forces are beyond us, and yet the end result is foisted individually upon us. And there's a lot of personal judgments that are attached to them. I always say, try to take what works and what spurs you to your next great thing and leave the rest behind, right? Because if it's not working, it doesn't help you. It's not productive, constructive criticism.
Yeah. I mean, I think what you said is so important about really understanding what is your responsibility and what's within your control, and knowing what's not your responsibility and what you don't have control over. And I think we oftentimes confuse the two, and then, place additional like pressure and stress upon ourselves to fix systemic things that individually we just can't address on our own. So I think that's really, really important advice.
Can
Margaret,
I say one other quick thing, Alia? And that is this, one of the things that I think culturally, and this isn't just about women in the workplace, the American culture tends to value a set of personality characteristics that are most traditionally associated with masculine characteristics. Those are identified as leadership characteristics. And this goes beyond gender, but those sort of aggressive tendencies, directive tendencies, tend to get overvalued in a lot of workplaces. And so understanding our value and seeing the value in others that don't fit that mold and that communicate and contribute to teams in different ways is also an absolutely critical evolution of we as women in workplaces, but also the evolution that's required of the people that we answer to in the culture of workplace here in the United States. Thanks for letting me say that.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And just to quickly respond to that, I think the word, evolution about the expectations for how you lead are, things are changing. I think especially now with a lot of employees working remotely and not being in person, and just the dramatic differences in working that, COVID has advanced pretty quickly. I think that though, that type of leadership style is a thing of the past, and people respond much, much better and now are expecting and demanding for leaders to be able to demonstrate higher emotional intelligence and empathy and listen more than you're talking, and work towards collaboration versus command and control. So I think hopefully we're in a time where we're going to start to see change in what is expected of leaders and the qualities that are valued in them. Margaret, I'm going to bring it back to you, and I want to talk a little bit about something that you talked about in the film. So you said that, you were often the only woman and always the only Black woman in rooms that were dominated by white men in banking. In what ways did you show up differently than those men? And were those differences valued?
Well, I would have to say that I didn't show up differently. And by that, I mean, I showed up as a woman or a Black woman or a Black person being the only one. And oftentimes when we had to do introductions, I would actually say out loud, well, here I am again, the only woman, or here I am again, the only Black person in the room. And that seemed to change the aura in the room, because I'm a firm believer that you need to acknowledge probably who you are when you're in a room full of white men. I used to call them white boys in suits. And then people told me to stop saying that, although I haven't. But I agree with Maggie in that you set the pace and you decide what's going to happen. And all of us, the women out here that I've been in contact with all of these years, we all understand how we got to where we are and why we have to fight so hard for whatever it is we feel we should be getting. But when it comes to being a Black woman walking into a room full of white men, I'm going to go back to what I said earlier about my age and my experience. Oftentimes, I felt like I was smarter than anybody else in that room. And there could be 500 people in that room, but I still felt like I was the smartest person in the room. And I sometimes would say that out loud because I felt like it was important for me to, stake my ground, so to speak, and make sure that they were aware of the fact that they were not going to push me around. But the thing I never lost sight of, even to this day, is that, and I think Maggie sort of alluded to this, and Sarah did too in the beginning when she was talking about this whole situation, is that this is cultural. The way men treat women, it's like they're you know, if it had a name, it would be like their namesake. This is the way they feel the most comfortable when they are doing the things they do as men. And don't get me wrong, I know a lot of good guys. I've had a lot of men support me. But at the end of the day, even the ones who support me, I've often thought to myself, if they had to choose between me and their cronies, they would take their cronies every time. So since COVID started, I've lost track of the number of women, particularly Black women, who have said to me how since they've been working at home, the migraines are gone, the blood pressure's gone down, the tension they felt, kicking their cat or dog when they got home. All of those things are different because they're not in this environment that we're all well aware of, that puts us in the position of starting out the day feeling like I'm not going to be good enough no matter what I do. So I had to really work hard to get around that. And my way of getting around it has been to just put it in your face. Yeah, I'm in this room and you're not going to get rid of me. But that puts this enormous amount of pressure on you then to be that perfectionist Maggie was talking about, where you feel like you can never make a mistake. And one thing about me personally is I hate to lose. And when I was little, my grandmother told me one time when I was sitting on the porch crying, because me and my sister had our umpteenth argument. And she's, you know, walked away from me sitting on the porch going, boy, you are really stupid. My grandmother said to me, Margaret, if you want to win the arguments, you have to arm yourself with the facts. I never forgot that. So even when I would get in arguments or disagreements with the male industry I was in, I made sure that before I jumped out there and said anything, that I had my facts. And sometimes, you know, I would get vilified for saying something because my facts always involved the way men perceive women. And we all know that it's not fair. But at the end of the day, I feel like one of the reasons that women are making progress is because we are less and less and less willing to accept that we are inferior. We are not. We are on the top. Did I answer your question?
Yes, you did, and more. Yes, you did, and more. I've got about 30 questions based off of what you said. Let me try to boil this down to just a couple.
Okay.
So I think you are absolutely right. I mean, when you were talking about the, you know, people not experiencing migraines or the type of, you know, like physical stress that shows up when you're in a workplace, you know, it's because there's an immense amount of energy and mental gymnastics you're doing.
Yes.
You know, because you're thinking about the dynamics and, you know, all of the things that happen that are nonverbal in a room that impact your experience in ways that, you know, sometimes other groups don't have to experience. So
Yes.
I think you're so, you know, on point with that. One of the things you alluded to is that, you know, women face adversity, but women of color have different experiences than white women that are not often talked about in professional settings. How do those experiences differ?
I think the primary difference is no matter what Black women do, there'll always be a Black woman. You know, there's a big difference. The racism and discrimination that is sort of like one of the underpinnings of this country and can affect people in so many ways, that is ingrained and does not go away. So while, you know, I think we talked about earlier how last hired, first fired, that became a mantra for a long time, because you could have white people not doing their job, white women not doing their job, but they don't get let go. It's like our color is just another thing that gets piled on top of us when people are making decisions about who to let go. When I first went to Republic Capital Bank, I got to meet Frank Banholzer, who was the chairman when I first started there, but then after that, he avoided me. So I just burst into his into the corporate third C-suite, whatever you want to call it, and went into his office. And I said, I'm just wondering why you're avoiding me. You brought me here to save your banks, you know, something along those lines. And after sitting there for a minute, he said, you know, I'm just not as sure how to approach you. I knew exactly what he meant. If I'd been a white woman, he probably would have never said that to me. And I said back to him, well, he says, I just don't, you know how to treat you. And I said, why don't you treat me like your best asset? And so that's how I feel women have to think, and they have to communicate this to the men that are around them. We became great friends, and he became one of my, what I would describe as unusual kind of mentors. But my ultimate goal was for him to talk to the other white men, because when they brought me into this room, I was the only woman and the only Black person. And that's what he did. He started having conversations, not just around my numbers, but the value I brought as a Black person who had been brought into that bank to be an asset for the bank. But in order for that to work, I had to feel like I was in control. When Maggie was talking, you couldn't see me, but I was nodding my head, because that control issue is a huge issue. And it affects Black people more, because we come into a situation where we may be the only Black woman, Black professional woman, Black leader, where people are denigrating us. They're not thinking of us as leaders. They're not seeing us as valuable. I had an employee say to me in one of my jobs, well, you know, the reason you're here is we have a quota. He got mad at me because of something I said to him, and that was his response. He's still alive, you know, but just barely. So that's my point is, we get affected differently, because not only are we dealing with the sexism part of it, but we're dealing with the racism part of it, which is so deep and sometimes insidious that you're not really sure what's going on, but you know that you're being discriminated against.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, you know, you at the beginning talked about, you know, the man who had a difficult time approaching you, and it was really based on fear, you know. And I mean, I'm
Yes.
in DEI work, and I think you can say that, you know, across any underrepresented or marginalized group, is that when there is a lack of exposure, you know, to individuals who represent some major element of difference than you do, there oftentimes is a fear, you know, versus a curiosity, and trying to understand how you can better understand the experiences of those individuals, versus like, I'm not going to approach you because, you know, I'm not accustomed to, you know, dealing with people like you. So that fear,
that fear also comes from Black women, or just Black people in general, especially in the professional and corporate world. And that's something that I don't think is generally understood, is we come in with a certain amount of fear and trepidation, wondering when, you know, that first negative comment is going to get made, or how our work is going to get looked at, or our, you know, our station in life. All of those kinds of things are rolled into one when it comes to a Black woman who's considered a leader or high up in the organization. This is why you don't see a lot of long-term, very astute, smart, sharp Black women being around a long time, like you might see a white woman being around for a long time. And white women have the same issues, but they don't have to deal with the racism, which is so deep and knife stabbing that sometimes you wonder if it's okay for you to even take a deep breath.
yeah, yeah. And what you're saying is that you're dealing, as a woman of color, you're dealing with all of these things in your organization, but you're also dealing with your own, like, you know, your own personal fear around whether or not you're good enough, around when the other shoe is going to drop, So there's like the fear of what is, might happen on the other end, but also your own fears based on past experiences. So there's that as well. Yeah. So I'm going to shift to talk about, I'm going to stay on the topic of being a person of color and how that's impacted your experiences. But one of the things that was really striking to me about your story is, it made me think about when you are the first, person of color or woman or first whatever, or you're one of a few, that you are more under the microscope. And, you are this Black woman, first woman in Wisconsin to open a bank, first, Black woman to do it. And in these situations, you typically receive more scrutiny, and you also have the eyes of your own community on you. And that community is more intensely rooting for you, knowing that your representation, or that people see you as representation of, the Black community. That pressure, not to fail can be so, so daunting. Did you feel that pressure? And if so, how did you deal with it?
Yes, and all in all capital letters. My theme song became "I'm Every Woman" by Whitney Houston and Shaka Khan. They both could sing different versions of it, but that's how you feel, that you're every woman, because the people in your, I can't even describe to you how I felt, but I can tell you that the way people in the Black community looked at me and how they were cheering me on was, I would have people stop me in Walgreens and go, "You don't know me, but I bank at your bank. And here's what you did for me." All kinds of things. There was a poet, Muhib. He was introducing me. I was a keynote speaker at an event, and he wrote a poem. And the poem was called "Our Community's Been Praying For." And every line in the poem started with "Our community's been praying for," and then says something about what I'd done in the community. I'm getting goosebumps telling you this, but the pressure is unbelievable. And then you're having to combat the racism and the discrimination that's on the other side, where people are hoping that you'll fail or you won't make it. So it's, I think I used the word before, insidious. It really is, when your own community's expectations of you are up in the sky. And I'm spent a lot of time saying to myself, I hope I rose to the challenge. And many Black leaders feel this same way, because when it's us, everything's on our back to make sure that it all goes right. And that is something that, you carry with you to your grave. Did I do it right?
Yes. Thank you so much for sharing that. That is so true. I think every, Black leader, other people of color who are in leadership positions for the first time, the pressure is relentless. And it is something, like you said, you all of a sudden are thrust very unexpectedly. You don't even understand it, into the spotlight.
Yes.
And everybody is watching your every move, because they're looking for a role model. They haven't seen it before. So they're looking like, oh, this must be the way that it needs to be done. Right. So even your mistakes are highlighted, and it can be an incredibly difficult position,
Oh yes, those mistakes really, they really get highlighted. But one thing I want to say about, even this whole thing of doing the film and us having the panel discussion today, one of the things that I like about organizations like Tempo is that the women who are in the organization kind of get it, that we are able to get in a room and have some open discussions about what people are feeling, because the world will never be right for women unless it's right for all women. Yes. And that is what I'm hoping that, we take out of all of this, that it'll never be right for women unless it's right for all women. So we're in this fight together. I get goosebumps when I'm talking about this, because this is so important. And we need to have women of different races and ethnicities and things to turn to, because we all have common thread kinds of experiences where we're just treated bad because we're women. But then if you understand how women of color are treated, and you can look at that situation and say, I need to fight for this situation too, the way Black women say we need to fight for the situation for all women. This is the crux of what we're doing. So when you're engaged in things like this, I always say to people, you know, if the women who are listening to this and who eventually get to see the film, if they just talk to 10 people in their circle about how women have always been on top, but, you know, we've been suppressed by men who get giddy with power and think, you know, we're supposed to be at home with pearls on. When I think about how I used to love Leave It to Beaver and June Cleaver with her pearls in her apron, I'm just like, what was I thinking of? But my point is, there's something in this for all of us to learn. And I feel like one of the reasons that women are starting to make progress is because we decided we're not going to take this anymore.
Yeah.
If I can, Alia, I think it's really critical for us to start saying some of the quiet parts out loud repeatedly all the time, right? And one of the things that is a phenomena for women, but acutely a phenomena that we're seeing for Black women in C-suites, is they'll put us in positions and set us up to fail so that we can be affected. Oh, see, we put a woman, a person of color, a woman of color in this position and they can't hack it.
Yeah.
I will tell you, listening to Margaret speak and the moments in my, like, it still brings tears to my eyes being told that you are not worthy, that you have not cut it, that you are not qualified.
Yeah.
And the biggest piece for me, and I would think in different ways for each of us and how we navigate that feeling. And again, the first time I heard imposter syndrome defined, I went, oh, wait, that's a thing. This isn't just like my crazy that's happening inside of my own head all the time. Is that when we engage and we advocate for others, it helps us, right? And so my own professional path quickly became deeply enmeshed and will forever be part of equity work, specifically the elevation of Black voices and women of color in particular. Because if it's not okay for women of color, it's not okay and it's not a good place for me.
Right. That's very true. Yes.
100%, Margaret. Like you said that, I was like, let's put that on t-shirts, right? Like that's it right there. And that judgment that we have of ourselves, wow, that is really devastating. You know, when you talk to folks about the concept of shame and what we feel when we have had a failure or something that hasn't been as successful as we wish, shame is completely useless as an emotion. It doesn't get us to do anything. In fact, it takes all of our power away from us. So if we understand that shame doesn't work, what is something that empowers? And for me, decentering myself, it's not about me, and trying to find my allyship and to elevate the voices of people of color and women has made my path, which I never thought it would. It was just something instinctively that I found my way to. That has alleviated it being about me and all of this internal judgment, because if I make it about all of us and elevating people other than myself, that empowers me, right? And it ends up helping you along the way, but that was never an intentional part of that. It was, I can make an argument for someone else, damn it, right? That was the point. And by doing that, that improves that space for everyone. And it was really, for me, it was, I felt safer arguing for someone else.
Yeah. But you know, I'll tell you something else too. There was a common theme through this film. This is what I loved about the film. And kudos to Beta Rudder and everybody who worked on it. But I heard a common theme from every one of those remarkable women in that film, that we are not going to take this laying down. The thing I was the most proud of is everybody who was talking, it was clear that they had learned from their experiences and they were willing to reach back and bring other women with them to help them avoid those other experiences. This is so important to me because it's something I've lived on for my whole professional life, is that if I'm doing something well, I'm going to bring other women along. That theme is in the film, and it really ties in with the whole thing about the tintype, because after Margaret was explaining to us about the tintypes and what all that meant, I love old movies and old Hollywood and stuff like that. And I started seeing what she was saying about when you see some of these photos, there's no women in these photos.
Mhm.
But, so it's the tension, it's all of the things that are wound up together, that we have to open those doors and talk to each other about how we can move things along, which I feel is why we're starting to see more women. Even in the film industry, it's still a tiny, tiny little bit, but I talk to more and more women who are not as fearful as they was even a couple of years ago around becoming a producer or a filmmaker or a director, or somebody behind the scenes or in front of the camera. And I think that when people see visual things and they hear other women saying, look at what I went through, I survived it, it gives them the courage to say, I can do that too.
Yeah, absolutely. I, following up on those amazing points, I do want to ask all three of you in just a moment. I'll ask you, what strategies that you've used, that you've seen used, or that you would hope to see used to promote the inclusion of women and other marginalized groups in the workplace. I'll get to that in a moment, but before we get to that, and I want to hear what all three of you have to say about that. But Margaret, Maggie, question for you before we get there. And this is sort of going off of some of the other things that Margaret was saying about, or maybe both of you, about women and sometimes women of color not being set up for success when they're brought in as a token, really in certain positions, and some of the harmful things, that are said or done, or certain behaviors that really put a mark on your confidence. But one of the things that made me think about was microaggressions. It's something that, we now have language for and we talk about often. Women, people of color, LGBTQIA plus individuals, and other marginalized groups often face microaggressions in the workplace based on their identity. And Maggie, I'm curious, have you ever experienced microaggressions in your career? And if so, how did you handle them? When does it make sense to respond to these? And when does it make sense not to?
Thanks, Alia. First, I want to talk about tokenism for a second. And this is a literal tactic that I want to share that I came by that was hard for me to learn. And that was find out what the demography of that entity, institution, department, division that you're about to accept a job in, find out what their demographics are. I made that mistake in my career when I joined a firm and there were literally 0 female equity partners in the practice area that I was going into. And for a global law firm with over 2,000 lawyers worldwide, that should have been a huge red flag to me. And I don't mean, are there women? I mean, are there LGBTQIA plus folks? Are there Latino folks? Are there Black folks? Are there folks that are different from me? Did everyone go to an Ivy League school? Is everyone from a socioeconomic class where they all hung out at the same yacht club? That kind of stuff is really problematic because I did not come from a family of great means. And so there was this other layer of sort of socioeconomic access that was really difficult for me to navigate as well. And I think that that's something that isn't talked about enough for women and people of color, particularly if you might be first generation or first into certain professional environments. I was the first lawyer in my family. We didn't come from much. And all of a sudden I was talking to people who were speaking a completely different language. And I again felt shame about not being a person of great means. So I just wanted to kind of throw that out there, is ask about demographics It's really important because it's an immediate data point. It doesn't tell the whole story, but certainly tells a story. But let's talk about your question specifically, Alia. So I don't ever use the word microaggressions because, pardon my language here, that SH blank T is not micro at all when you are on the receiving end of that. It is macro as macro could get. It is an essential challenge to your personhood. It is aggressive. It is unacceptable. So have we experienced them? Hell yes. How much time do we have to talk about that? It goes from me being assumed I'm getting the coffee, that I'm a secretary, that I can't add 2 + 2. I was an economist before I was a lawyer. They never think I know anything about math, heaven forbid, when in reality, they can't. And I've said this and I need to continue to say this. A lot of times, as Margaret said, the men in the room aren't qualified to tie my shoes, let alone evaluate my credentials. And yet I'll be asked to pick up their paper for them. This happened 6 months ago to me in a public county board hearing. A supervisor repeatedly requested an actual expert and someone that's a real professional in a certain area. Well, I responded to that because I'm now in a position where I can respond, but not all of us are in that place. So what do? Let's talk about those of us who may not be in that position to call that baloney out when it's happening. And this gets down, it ties back to my original demography point, because if you have diverse demography in your entity, in your department, in your division, you will find that there are allies there, those that you can align yourself with and say, I need help. I don't know what to do. This just happened to me. Are you someone that can help me articulate this? Are you someone that together we can speak? I have often said one voice alone can be shouted down, but all of us shouting together in unison cannot. Those voices have to grow to a roar, and until they are, this is the work that has to be done. That's what allyship is. I look for those people. I try to align myself with them. And those of us who are in a place to speak, when we hear microaggressions directed towards others, speak up. When it is about misogyny in the workplace, I have expressly asked male leaders around me, I have already spoken up. It's still happening. I need you to tell that man to sit down and shut his mouth in a respectful way, but I need you to speak up with me, not for me, with me, alongside of me. So I think allyship, context is really important. And here's the last thing I'll say on this topic. Sometimes those aggressions and that minimization of our viewpoint, our lived experience is what we have to offer is intentional. Sometimes it's not. And those unintentional minimizations or dismissing of us as a group or one of your colleagues, those that are unintentional, that are ignorant to their own implicit biases, those are the people, the hearts and minds that I hope to capture, that we all hope to capture, to bring their bias into their consciousness and correct it, to partner with people who want to do better, to constantly make this correction. I want to be in places and spaces and working with people that want to have those discussions and that realize that a correction isn't a personal judgment on them. I'm not calling them a racist or a sexist. I'm calling on them to partner with me and us in this good work that we all can do better every day.
Yeah. I mean, you just said a mouthful, starting with these aren't microaggressions, these are macro. You're absolutely right, especially because they happen repeatedly. For those of us who experience them, it's never a one-time thing that you experience it. I mean, oftentimes it's, daily. And you're trying to figure out, should you pick this battle? And, what I like about what you said was shifting the burden solely from the person who's on the receiving end of a microaggression to, allies and people's in position of power who have the influence and authority to do something about it and, to shout from the mountaintops with them. So it's not them always on their own, feeling like they're, in defensive mode.
If I can, just very briefly, I want to give a really clear example of this. I graduated from law school in 2003. And that means I was in law school when 9/11 happened. The things that I heard said in law school classrooms about people of the Islamic faith were beyond the pale. I am not a Muslim, but I knew that it was incumbent upon me to say something. And it is often in moments of these greatest stressors when the lowest common denominator, the most salacious generalization, becomes an easy talking point that those that know better must not be bullied into silence. These things matter, and they matter whether they're said in a room of 3 people, 300, 300,000. If you know better, you have an obligation to speak. You needn't shout if that's not your way. Margaret and I might share a bit more of the shouting impetus, but if shouting's not your way, say it in the way that you can, but say something. When you hear it, you must speak up.
I appreciate your very, direct approach in telling people how to address that, because I think a lot of times people hear it, but don't feel like they have the permission to say something if they don't belong to that demographic group. So, say there's a microaggression against someone who's queer and they're not a member of the LGBTQIA plus community. They feel like, well, if that person didn't speak up, maybe it's not offensive to them. But I think, what we all need to realize is it's offensive, period. It's offensive, it doesn't matter if somebody took offense to it, and it doesn't matter whether or not that person spoke up. It could be that would be the third battle that person had to take up, on that day, and they don't have the energy for it. So, I think it's really important for people to understand that not only do you have permission, but there's a responsibility, to speak up when something like that happens. We have about 12 minutes left. We have probably 8 minutes left of discussion. I don't see any questions in the chat. And I have plenty for the group. But while you're all thinking, if you want to throw questions in there, great. If not, that's fine. But the question I wanted to go back to for all three of you, and we'll start with you, Margaret, then we'll go to you, Sarah, and then you, Maggie, is what things, have you done or have you seen or would you hope to see that, supports inclusion of underrepresented or marginalized people within the workforce? So Margaret, if you could start.
So to me, the most important thing is kind of along the lines of what Maggie said, that everybody who knows what's happening is wrong has to speak out collectively. And I think what we found, over the years, as women and minorities have had some, modicum of success, it's where people have spoken out and said, this is wrong. The other thing that has really helped, in my opinion, is the visual things that people see and hear. Technology, TV, more access to things that can point out what's wrong has helped really to open up the entire world, if you stop and think about it, to recognizing that we cannot continue to be successful unless everybody buys into we're all equal.
And I think you were just on mute when you said something, Alia.
Oh, sorry. Thanks for that, Margaret. Sarah, wanted to move to you to get your response to that.
Yeah, I completely agree with Margaret. And I think a couple of things come to mind. So, just one thing that personally I've been trying to do as a leader is, recognizing that sometimes when I'm feeling at my most vulnerable, maybe that's the time that I should think about speaking up. So thinking about like a personal example, that imposter syndrome, that constant fear that you're going to get voted off the island if you show even like a little bit of a chink in your armor. I've thought about that a lot, being a mom and a woman and a creative director. There aren't a lot of female creative directors, and certainly not a lot that have kids. And, I feel like it took me a long time to get here. But, I've tried to purposely go out of my way now to share kind of stories of like when I feel like something isn't going well, or when I'm feeling, like I'm having a day, or something absolutely ridiculous happens and I just had to juggle 6 things. I'm trying to go out of my way to actually share that. Just because I feel like I've gotten so much reaction from that, like people saying, "Oh, thank you for speaking up." So, I can speak up from my own personal experience, but I've been surprised at the times that it's resonated not just with another mom, but with a dad, and that's when I felt like, wow, that's making a big difference. That, maybe men kind of feel like, oh wow, thank goodness she's speaking up, because now I've had to play into this, kind of macho structure. And if someone who's in a powerful position is speaking up, maybe I don't have to. So I think that's one thing that we as leaders can do, just to make sure that we're thinking about how all the different voices are being accepted. But then also I've been thinking a lot about just that idea of the bigger expectations that we put on women and people of color, that almost, they have to prove themselves more than maybe a man would to even get offered a position. So just, as a person who hires people, like thinking about how can we break some of that mold and give people a shot who, maybe are coming with a little bit of a different but related experience, but you can see that they've got a real spark, and give them a chance, versus playing into that old model of, well, I'm going to expect that person to have proven themselves 3 times over before they're offered the same position that, maybe a man would be.
Yep. Yep. And I like what you talked about, like just being relatable. I think when you're relatable, people pay attention more, and it builds trust with people, versus keeping up, your guard. And that's not what people relate to, because everybody can see when things are going well, but it's like, what's in the challenges and how do you address those things, I think, really get people's attention. Maggie, I'll have you respond to that question as well. And then I do have a question that came in the chat. So that'll probably be our last question before we close up.
So I wanted to start with this, which I unfortunately have to say way too many times, which is, gee whiz, here's another mediocre white dude failing up. Okay. Wow. It happens all the time. Okay. So we want to talk about DEI and B that works. One of the fundamental things that organizations have to do is the very specific tactical change your frickin' job requirements to dispense with unnecessary credentialing and degrees, and to always include in every job posting, in every way that you recruit, or other representative experience. When I interview lawyers, I've got nothing against the Harvard educated lawyer, but I want to know about their biggest personal hardship that they faced, what that was and how they overcame it. I want to know what their biggest career failure was. I want to understand about how someone approaches real complex problems that aren't academic, that aren't about someone else. Their humanity, right? Tactically, we are promoting white mediocre dudes upwardly when they are unprepared for the roles that they get in, while we establish barriers to entry that are almost too numerous to number for women and people of color, and women of color especially, as well as underrepresented folks from the LGBTQIA community. So what does that mean? We should stop expecting women and people of color and other underrepresented groups to demonstrate skills and competencies that vastly exceed what is required for their current role before we'll even look at them for promotion. A good rule of management is you promote people before they're ready, and then you mentor, coach, and manage people into competency. We seem to do that ad nauseum for white mediocre men that are failing up. And yet at the first sign of setback, challenge, or failure for women or people of color, it's like, whoa, they clearly can't cut it. This is intentional work that is done every day. So DEI and B, I think there have to be very specific tactics that managers and leaders are thoughtful about. to bring into consciousness our own implicit biases. The other thing I look for is the CEO committed to this work? Is this work part of the CEO's language every day? Is this part of a cultural commitment within this organization? How is their pay equity? Again, show me the data. These are the types of commitments I want to see in organizations. And I'll end with this. I've never worked at a place like Milwaukee County that has made this part of the air that we breathe in such an intentional way. Do we fail at this all the time? Of course we do, but this ain't a light switch, folks. We're not going to undo institutional racism, misogyny, and homophobia, and basically any phobia of other that is not white, male, land owning rich folk, right? We don't undo all of that institutional discrimination overnight. This is day-to-day commitment that is coupled for those of us that come from privileged groups to humble ourselves, to be open to the critical thinking and feedback to make those organizations better. And I say enough of the mediocre white dudes failing up. I've had my fill.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I have nothing else to say to that, Maggie, except amen. Thank you for that. We do have to wrap just to be respectful of people's time. So I'm going to hand it over to Linda, but just wanted to thank you all so much. We could have talked for hours. I could listen to you for hours on end, but really appreciate your time. Everything you've been speaking about today is incredibly valuable and has been said in ways that I haven't heard before. So thank you so much.
Yes, wonderful. First of all, thank you so much to everybody here. Very open, honest, raw conversation. And I think that's something that is important for us to continue to consider. So thank you so much for your time. By the way, if you have enjoyed the film, if you received a link to the film, if you haven't watched the film, it's a 27-minute film. I would encourage you to watch it. The stories that you heard today from Margaret and Maggie are featured along with several other women's stories, and they all have a powerful commentary on women in business, women as leaders, and again, how far we've come and how far we still need to go. So I think that this also provides us an opportunity to consider a conversation like we just had here at your company. The more that we can offer vehicles for conversations, avenues to spur these discussions, the more we will learn from each other and be able to make change within the workforce, within our own organization. So we want to make sure that you are aware that the film and a discussion guide are available to you if you would like to have a screening at your company. And actually, we could also even potentially arrange for one of the women in the film to show up if you wanted to do something in person or do something virtually. There's no mandatory charge to hold a screening of Direct Positive. However, we encourage organizations that do screen the film to make a donation of $100 to the Tempo Foundation, which provides educational and professional development opportunities for women in our community. So there is you see the contact information on this slide. If you are interested in learning more about a screening of Direct Positive, simply contact Gina. After this session, likely tomorrow, you will receive a follow-up email from Tempo, where they will provide you with this contact information, the discussion guide, and a survey. We'd like to hear from you to see what you thought of this session, and certainly any feedback that you have for us so that we can continue to bring really wonderfully provocative and in-depth conversations along this line. So again, really appreciate the time and the effort and the great things that we learned today from our panel. And with that, I hope you all have a wonderful evening and take care.